Thanks, Nin. Thanks, and thanks very much for Divisco for sponsoring this session. Now, we have about 25, 30 minutes to cover a broad range of topics. So first I want to give you a basic overview of protein and weight management, and then talk about some more practical issues, how protein metabolism, protein synthesis ties in with satiety issues, feeling full after meals. Then we'll start to get into some more practical areas. We'll talk about protein distribution throughout the day as an attempt to both build and maintain muscle mass, as well as regulating body weight, body fat. And then we'll talk about some specific clinical populations, folks who are most at risk of losing muscle mass, and some of the new research on nutritional interventions to try and protect them. And finally, as Nin suggested, we'll talk about some unique properties of supplements like whey protein and the recent research that's being conducted into the amino acid leucine. So with that, when we're talking about body composition and weight management, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about your body weight on the scales or body fat. Now, if you go to any talk on sarcopenia or muscle loss with age, they're going to present a figure something like this. And this is the fairly typical trajectory of body composition as we age. For most of us, starting somewhere around 40 years of age, we go on a fairly gradual, slow loss of muscle mass. And that's about 1% per year. It's insidious. We don't really notice its passage. But all too often, in Western societies in particular, this subtle loss of muscle mass is accompanied by an increase in body fat. So our actual weight on the bathroom scales isn't going to change that much, but our body composition tends to alter quite dramatically. Now, what can we do about this? Well, we're kind of helped and hampered by the fact that there is so much material out there that is usually getting in the way of really informing us to what the science is speaking to. Too many people trying to make a quick dollar and polluting the science. So I'll try and do my best to cut through a lot of this and give you a sense of where the research is right now and perhaps where it is going in the next few years. Now, when we're talking about factors contributing to obesity, for an example, way too many factors to talk about in one single lecture, but here's a snapshot of some of the behavioral and physiological factors ranging from breakfast skipping or just meal avoidance and then overeating and snacking throughout the rest of the day. Portion size, we're going to talk about quite a bit. Mindless eating, not so much. But quite a host of different factors contributing to the population getting larger. Now, the whole idea of protein being beneficial in terms of regulating body weight, if we look at almost every single one of the research studies, the longer term feeding trials where we've brought people into a research setting and we've put them on controlled diets for 3 to 6 months, every study that has moderately increased protein in the diet, and importantly at the expense of usually simple carbohydrates, sugars, has found improvement in almost every metabolic parameter that we've measured. So if you were to go on a 3-month diet, energy controlled, slightly more protein, slightly less carbohydrate, you're going to find benefits in terms of your blood lipids, cholesterol. You'll have improved satiety, and I'll show you some of this data, sense of fullness after you eat a higher protein meal. Increased thermogenesis, basically that means it takes a little bit more energy to digest and metabolize a protein-rich meal than it would a similar fat or carbohydrate-based meal. And improvements in body composition. And I'll show you some of that data. Here's just an example of some of the research that's looking at outcomes. Now, these folks were on I think it was a 12-week diet, moderate protein, and one of them, they give a high carbohydrate diet or a higher protein diet and looked at outcomes like weight loss. And that's the graph on your left there. And you can see that the people on the higher protein diet had a little bit more overall weight loss. And that's fine. That's not really too much of a big deal. But when you look at fat loss, you can see that most of the weight loss attributable to these diets was in the higher protein group. And reading between the lines here, this basically means that the higher protein diet was able to protect muscle mass while helping to allow fat mass to occur, which is exactly what we want to happen throughout our lifespan. Now, in terms of satiety, it's a very subtle effect. No one is going to lose a lot of body weight because protein is slightly more satiating than carbohydrate. But it's the sum of these little benefits that can add up to a larger effect. Now, if we look at the differences between a moderate and a higher protein meal, people's sense of how full do you feel, it's not big, but there is a fairly slight increase. So if you have a protein meal compared to a carbohydrate breakfast, for example, you're going to feel a little bit fuller after the protein meal, and that may help you reduce the amount of snacking or overeating that occurs later that day. Okay, so let's talk more now about protein and muscle. Now, this was one of the first studies that we're able to do to look at how much protein do we actually need to build and repair muscle. Now, this was a very simple study where we brought folks into our laboratory, young and old adults. The young guys were about 28 years of age. The older adults were closer to 70. And we simply gave them 30 grams of protein. And in this case, it was about 115 grams of lean beef. Now, we measured muscle protein synthesis. So this is one of these invasive studies where we're able to take muscle biopsies from the leg and work out how many of these amino acids are being physically incorporated into protein over time. So with the 30-gram meal, we saw a very robust 50% increase in both the young and the older adults' ability to take that actual protein-rich food and start to turn it into muscle. We had to ask the follow-up question, 30 grams of protein, 4 ounces, 100 grams of beef or chicken. No one in America eats that little. So we wanted to do a dose response to give our subjects more of a typical portion size that we're consuming in restaurants. So we gave them, it was about 350 grams of lean beef, 12 ounces, thinking that if we got an extra increase in muscle protein synthesis, that would be good. But obviously we'd need to balance that with the extra energy, the extra calories that they were consuming. Now, sometimes a no difference result in science is disappointing, but I think this is a really powerful message of moderation. Now, to me, this suggests that, despite giving someone 3 times as much protein in a single meal, their ability to use it was capped way before that. So this suggests that somewhere around 30 grams of protein in a single meal represents a ceiling effect, the maximum amount that we can take in at any one time and effectively use to build and repair muscle. Now, this has a tremendous amount of application when we start talking about planning our meals, and I'll show you some of this. Now, I should say, if you give a young and older adult a moderate amount of protein, they're going to do really quite well. Now, the big problem occurs, though, with older adults if you halve the amount of protein in a single meal, say 15 grams. The young adult will have a proportional decrease, half the protein synthetic response, and that makes sense. With the older adult, if you halve the amount of protein, give them 10, 15 grams in a single meal, you're going to have a very disproportionate reduction in their ability to use that small amount of protein. So 10 grams of protein for an older adult really doesn't go very far in terms of stimulating muscle growth and repair. And that's a key point here. So turning this into practical advice, this is what I see as the fundamental problem with diets in most Western countries. And think about your own diets if you like. In most countries, breakfast tends to be a very heavily carbohydrate-biased meal. A lot of us migrate towards the breakfast cereals, bread products, and the like. Now, if you had a bowl of oatmeal, for example, porridge, oats have some protein, add some milk, a little bit more. Maybe that has 10 grams of protein. Now, 10 grams, that's okay for some things, but it falls quite a way below the optimal amount for stimulating muscle growth and repair. Now, lunch is variable. Let's skip to the other end of the day. Now, at the evening meal, quite often it's turning into this protein festival where we're consuming these really ridiculous portion servings at a single time. So this is just a very simple pictorial example with 90 grams of protein available to us throughout the day, most of it in the evening meal. Now, most of you will be aware of the what they call the RDA for protein, recommended dietary allowance. It's 0.8. So this, but if you look at all the statistics, you'll see the average individual in most Western countries consumes about 1.3 grams of protein, 50% more than the RDA. Big problem is though, if you're consuming 65 grams at dinner, but your body can only use 30 grams in a single meal, suddenly the usable protein that your body is seeing actually falls way below the RDA. Okay, so we're overnourished, or overfed, but certainly undernourished. Okay, so this is the obvious next slide. So we're not advocating just blindly throwing extra protein at people's diets. For most of us, this is more of a thoughtful redistribution of the protein that's available to us. And in most cases, this means taking some of the protein that we're over-consuming during the evening meal and redistributing it to breakfast, with the basic idea getting multiple periods throughout the day where we're optimally stimulating the potential for muscle growth and repair. Does that make sense? Okay. Now here's the study that we've just finished. We're going to publish on this. We did this. We put people in our hospital setting. We took the muscle biopsies. We put them on the skewed or distributed diet, and we measured muscle protein synthesis. So on the left here, this is breakfast, 30 grams of protein versus 10 grams, and you can see 30 grams was better than 10. No big surprise. The figure on your right, though, that's the key one. Both groups had 90 grams of protein over 24 hours. The only difference was how it was distributed. The people that had 30-30-30 distribution had a much better, 25% better protein synthetic response over the course of the day. Now, while that isn't a massive difference, that's pretty much how we lose muscle mass. It's 1% per year. So even these slight differences, if this is how you habitually eat, over time can really manifest into a very gradual loss of muscle. Now, if we look at some of the other benefits, if you habitually eat a large carbohydrate-based breakfast cereals, carbohydrate's going to induce a large insulin response, and you're going to have lots of glucose, lots of insulin response. And you can see, though, with the even protein diet, the solid bars, you avoided having these large glucose and insulin excursions throughout the day. And anyone who's involved in diabetes research will tell you, if you can avoid having these big peaks and troughs in blood glucose and insulin, you're going to go a long way to maintaining metabolic health. And just finishing the picture with satiety, this was quite effective. We found that going from left to right here, fasted, both groups were as hungry as each other. After the breakfast meal, you can see that the skewed protein group, the group that we gave just carbohydrate to predominantly, was hungrier after they had the same amount of calories for breakfast. That's not really surprising. The really interesting part was after dinner, one group got a whole lot of protein, an entire chicken almost, and the other group got a much more modest serving. But both groups had the same satiety effect. So 30 grams of protein is really almost as satiating as the entire chicken. Okay, so you don't need these massive amounts of protein to fill you up or give you the metabolic benefits. Dinner. Okay, so let's transition into some clinical populations. Now, it's a really sad truism that in a hospital setting, bed rest has become a de facto treatment. When we hospitalize someone, we put them in bed. And if we were to repeat this study in any hospital through the world, we'd find similar results. What we did was basically put accelerometers and pedometers on our patients and measure how many steps they took while they were an inpatient. And these guys were hospitalized for just 4 days. The results were really quite horrifying. 95% of the time that they were in our hospital, they were completely inactive. They're lying in bed. The 5% of the time they were doing something, it was minimal, and it was either shuffling to the bathroom or getting physiotherapy. Okay, so we have a model of bed rest. But we can also expand this physical inactivity model. Physical inactivity comes in many different forms. Here's my uncle. The couch potato. The same process is happening in his muscles because he's not using them. And you've all seen examples of someone who's had their arm casted. It's physically inactive. You take the cast off, after several weeks, the arm is atrophied and withered. And certainly the other example that I'll show you about now is NASA. NASA's interested in the physical inactivity or the lack of gravity that occurs in space. And it just so happens to test the effects of microgravity. You can't do it in space. It costs about $30,000 a minute to exercise in space. So we do a bed rest study, which has a nice clinical overlap. So that's what we did. We did this study several years ago now. We took some healthy want-to-be astronauts, young males, and we put them in bed rest for 28 days. You can sign up for one of these studies after the session if you... their feet didn't touch the ground. We controlled their diets really quite rigorously. We took a host of measurements. This is muscle loss. So we did it's called a DEXA scan. Same thing they use for osteoporosis, bone mineral density, which allows us to essentially measure body composition. This here is muscle loss from the legs, just the hips down, in our young wannabe astronauts. So over 28 days, they lost about half a kilo of muscle from the legs. Now, that's a reasonable amount of muscle, but that's really not the population that's likely to be hospitalized or spend an extended period of time being inactive. So to make it more clinically relevant, we brought a group of older adults. They were about 70 years of age, and we put them in bed rest for 10 days, which is similar to the typical length of stay you'll see with a lot of medical conditions. Now, we really weren't too sure what to expect, but we didn't expect this. This was horrifying. In essentially 1/3 of the amount of time, they lost almost 3 times as much muscle. And that's starting with less muscle to begin with. And I should preface this by saying, to qualify to do one of these studies, it's invasive. We're taking muscle biopsies, we're filling you full of holes. You have to be really, really healthy to begin with. So this is absolutely a best case scenario. These are not the typical older adult in our community. Okay. And to make this worse, we fed them well. They received the RDA for protein, which is probably optimistic in most clinical populations. Now, I think it's always good to look at figures and slides. You can appreciate the differences. What I like to do sometimes when I've got students in particular is to make it a little more visual. All right. Here's a kilo. This is how much muscle our older guys were losing. It's dripping. In just 10 days. And this is just from their legs. And if you think about this in the context of your own leg or your parents or grandparents, this is a horrific amount of muscle. Now, if you put this together with the statistics that you hear, 50% of women over the age of 70 who fracture a hip never get out of bed again. Some of it's due to the trauma, but you can bet a lot of it is due to this catastrophic loss of muscle mass. Okay. This was a bugger to get through customs yesterday. If anyone has pets, see me afterwards. Okay, so let's expand this into a bed rest model. These were healthy adults, but we're treating our patients the same way. We're putting them on bed rest. And there's other complicating factors going on. You put someone in bed rest, so they're physically active. I'll show you how well we feed them. And if you're hospitalized, you're generally sick. You've got inflammation, cytokines, other catabolic stimuli going on. Here's another very simple study just detailing what our patients are being fed. We did a plate waste analysis. We looked at how much protein, if we just focus on that, was being delivered and how much was actually being consumed. And we did this for almost every possible diet combination, mechanical, soft, low sodium, etc. Now to start with, if we just focus on protein, the black bar was how much was delivered. And it was quite encouraging. On average, each of the meal trays had about 40 grams of protein, which is great. Gives you a little bit of flexibility. You can decide not to eat all of this or some of that. But the tragedy was they were consuming about 10 grams of protein. And for a healthy older adult, 10 grams really doesn't do all that much. For someone who's physically inactive, sick, got inflammation going on, it's absolutely useless. And it was complicated by the fact that about half the protein they were consuming came from this. Now, if I was to put any of you on a bed rest study, within about 3 or 4 days, you'd start to become insulin resistant. You're moving towards diabetes. These patients were pretty much always insulin resistant before they started. And if you start to throw really a lot of simple carbohydrates at them, their metabolism gets screwed up very, very quickly. We're not doing them any favors with this, tasty as it is. Okay, so again, we repeated the DEXA scan on a group of patients. They were closer to 80 years of age, and they all had community-acquired pneumonia. They were hospitalized for 3 days. I scanned them on admission and discharge 3 days later. So in 3 days, our patients are losing this large piece of muscle. And that's catastrophic. You can see how that easily fits into the statistics, the high rates of hospital readmission that we've got. Things that all the administrators are being concerned about. Okay, and why is it happening? Well, like I said, we did the muscle biopsies. We can look at indices like muscle protein synthesis. We basically measured protein synthesis over 24 hours before bed rest and then after 10 days of inactivity, and we found this really large 30% reduction in their ability to take the hospital food that they were receiving, and after bed rest, they can't use it to build and repair muscle, okay, despite giving them food. Now that's tragic, but fortunately, there seems to be a fairly simple intervention. Now, we know exercise would work, but it's not applicable for most of these patients. They're sick. They're not going to be able to do a lot of physical activity. Drugs will work, but again, it's pretty selective. So the only thing that we've got widely available is nutrition. And in this study, that's the 30% reduction in protein synthesis. We took another group of bed rest subjects and simply gave them additional protein during the bed rest period. And we found by giving them amino acids, protein, we were able to preserve muscle protein synthesis, which translated into the partial preservation of muscle and function, which is tremendous. If we give our patients more raw material, more muscle, more function, when they're discharged, it's going to make the recovery much faster. Okay, so let me finish with a few words on where the research is going. If you're following the physiology research, you're going to see a lot more research on leucine. Now, leucine is one of the branch chain amino acids. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of muscle. But people are looking at leucine because it has this unique ability to turn on the metabolic pathways that start muscle protein synthesis. It's basically the trigger. So by adding something with enough leucine, and the trigger is about 3 grams per meal, 3 grams of leucine. If you take that much, it turns on the metabolic pathways that allow the muscle to better use the other amino acids that are part of the regular diet. Okay? Now, the choices we have, we can give people plain isolated leucine, which tastes terrible, it's pretty expensive, it's not that easy to find. Or you can try and look for natural foods that are pretty high in leucine content. Here's a simple list. Whey protein isolate by far and away has the highest proportion of leucine. And when we're doing any of our clinical trials, cancer survivors, burn victims, etc., we always migrate towards the whey protein isolate, usually in an unflavored form, so we can tailor it for individual taste preferences. So, the conclusions. I think if at any time we can have a moderate increase in protein in our daily diet at the expense primarily of simple carbohydrates, we're going to see a beneficial effect on any health outcome that we can measure. Cholesterol, blood lipids, blood pressure, body fat, etc. We can't talk about protein recommendations as a daily amount. We need to talk about protein as a meal-specific amount. Protein over the course of the day is largely meaningless when we're talking about individual prescription. It has to be the amount per meal. Now, we can talk about specific quantities ad nauseum, but I think if we start with the basic goal of getting a moderate amount of high-quality protein 3 times a day as the starting framework, that will set most people up well. Then we can adapt it for athletes, patients, whoever the specific individual is. And for most of us, we're going to target 2 meals. Breakfast, adding some high quality protein, and for most of us, dinner, reducing the protein and energy. And if you are going to move towards supplementation for convenience, targeting special at-risk populations, look at the leucine content and then look at all the other amino acids. That has to be the first priority. With that, thank you very much, and I believe we've got some time for questions. Yeah. Yeah, so with athletes, the protein demands come in 2 forms. The overriding issue is that you still have to stay close to their energy requirements. And when you've got someone who's exercising a lot, their energy requirements are quite a bit higher. So they have to eat something, and you're going to be much better off on several levels if that extra something is protein. So for athletes, I say let's start with the basic framework, 30-30-30, and then look at when you're exercising, if it's a 1 a day or a 2 a day exercise session. Then you play with the snacks, and it becomes the protein after exercise story. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having 2 high-quality protein snacks, mid-morning, mid-afternoon of another 30 grams, if you've got room under your energy cap. If you're kidding yourself and going for a 20-minute walk and then chugging down another 30 grams of protein as chocolate milk, you're going to get fat. But if you can cope with that extra energy, it's a perfectly good strategy. So athletes, 5 or 6 times 30 is probably okay. For recreational athletes, stick with the basic 3 times a day and you'll be okay. Not really, no. No one's got the grant money to specifically look at athletes. If you've got the energy demands and want to go to 40 to meet your energy, that's probably fine. And most serious athletes are going to overconsume everything. It's going to be hard to cap it at 30 anyway. So no, there's absolutely no danger going to 50 grams per meal if you can cope with that without putting on body fat. Yeah. Yes?
There's been a lot of interest recent years about the use of leucine and branching amino acids in relation to insulin secretion. I just wanted if you could like to comment on that and what implications it might have with the people who are having bed rest and therefore having this probability of insulin resistance.
Yeah, so the question is leucine's effect on insulin release, and the way we're using it is we're adding a small amount of leucine to the regular meals. So we're combining it with extra protein and fat as well as carbohydrate. So by adding just a small amount of leucine, 3 grams per meal, we don't see any augmented increase in the insulin response. If we were to just give a leucine bolus, we're going to see a spike in insulin, but we don't see that when we've delayed gastric emptying with a mixed meal approach, which I think is also one of the benefits of giving leucine as a whey protein. So it's kind of an academic exercise. We can see it with leucine alone, but that effect is blunted when we use a real meal approach. Thanks.
So your presentation reminds me of my parents, right? So they're in their 60 years old. So I'm thinking they're losing their muscle mass like crazy. So for them, if they start with exercise and the right diet, can they regain their muscle back?
No. Absolutely yes. And that graph I showed you of the young and older adults responding similarly to a moderate amount of protein, we did another study I didn't show you. We got them to do exercise, just some simple sets of leg extension at the same or just after they had the protein-rich meal. And we saw a further 50% increase in the potential for muscle building. And again, it was the same in the young and older adults. So, aging doesn't necessarily impair our ability to respond to protein-rich foods. or exercise. Now, you have to be a little bit more careful prescribing exercise to older adults for several reasons, but the muscle still can respond. The biggest issue is getting the protein and the exercise fairly close together to benefit from that additive effect. The absolute worst thing you can do is skip breakfast or just have a piece of toast and then do your exercise or rehab, whatever that physical inactivity form takes, because you're going to miss that opportunity to get any sort of meaningful synergistic or additive effect. Yeah. Well, guys, if there's no further questions, thanks very much.